Welcome to Why Men Fight, Bertrand Russell's Vision for Peace and Progress, a podcast series exploring one of the most powerful critiques of war and society ever written. This is Episode 1, The War Within. Today, we uncover the roots of Russell's revolutionary ideas and the world that shaped them.
Yeah, and our mission today really is to jump right into the start of this truly foundational book, Why Men Fight.
We're focusing just on the very beginning.
Just the beginning.
Yeah.
The introduction and the preface, basically the first 15 pages or so in this Routledge Classics edition we're using.
Okay.
We really want to unpack his core premise. Where does war actually come from, according to Russell?
And it's so important, isn't it, to remember the context, the world he was writing this in.
Absolutely crucial.
This isn't like philosophy written in a vacuum. It came out of lectures he wrote in 1915, delivered early 1916, right smack in the middle of World War I, the Great War.
Right. The war is, you could say, the furnace where this work was forged.
Yeah.
And Russell, he states his aim right up front. It's pretty ambitious.
What does he say?
He says he wants to suggest a, quote, philosophy of politics based upon the belief that to promote all that is creative, and so to diminish the impulses and desires that center around possession.
Promote the creative, diminish the possessive. Wow, that's a big frame right from the get-go.
It is. And remember who he was talking to. These weren't just random lectures. He was speaking to sympathetic audiences. You know, pacifists, radical thinkers, people like C.K. Ogden were involved.
Right, people already questioning the war effort.
Exactly. And apparently they were absolutely captivated. There's this great quote from Lytton Strachey describing the impact.
Oh, yeah.
Strachey talks about Russell's mind just dismantling everything. He says Russell takes down all the established institutions, governments, religions, laws, property. Down they go like 9 pins.
Yeah, and they go like 9 pins. I love that. Strachey called it a charming sight.
Right. But then he adds that Russell also builds up these grand constructive ideas.
So it wasn't just tearing down, it was also about proposing something new, a different way forward.
Precisely. And that new vision, it seems, came from his deep dissatisfaction with how everyone else was explaining the war.
What were the common explanations at the time?
Well, in Britain, the dominant view was pretty simple. German wickedness. You know, the Huns were just inherently bad.
Okay, yeah, the standard propaganda line.
And even among many pacifists, the blame fell on, say, diplomatic mistakes, secret treaties, or maybe just the ambitions of governments.
Sort of external factors or specific groups being at fault.
Exactly. But Russell looked at all that and thought, no, that's missing the deepest root cause.
Which, for him, was...
He argued that these explanations fail to grasp the extent to which war fundamentally grows out of ordinary human nature.
Ordinary human nature. Wait a second. So he's not saying it's like uniquely German evil or scheming politicians. He's saying it comes from, well, from us.
That's his really provocative starting point. Yeah. He insists that Germans, governments, everyone involved, they're made up of, quote, average human beings actuated by the same passions that actuate others. Not differing much from the rest of the world except in their circumstances.
Yeah.
The potential for war, for this kind of conflict, isn't some alien thing. It's part of the human package.
That feels quite challenging to accept, especially when you think about the horrors of WWI happening right then. So if this capacity is within us, why do people go along with war so easily?
Well, Russell talks about this acquiescence in untrue and inadequate reasons. He suggests that maybe, deep down, there isn't this widespread, fundamental repugnance to war itself that we might expect. And this is where he drops that really fascinating, almost psychoanalytical idea. He says, unfounded beliefs are the homage which impulse pays to reason.
Okay, say that again. Homage which impulse pays to reason. That definitely sticks with you. What's he getting at there?
He's suggesting, I think, that our beliefs aren't always the logical drivers of our actions. Often it's the other way around.
How so?
Our underlying nature, our impulses, they crave certain actions, certain outcomes. And then almost subconsciously, we cook up beliefs, even beliefs that aren't really true, to make those impulsive actions seem rational or even noble, like a duty.
So beliefs become justifications.
Yeah.
Tools we use to feel okay about following our gut feelings or maybe darker urges.
That's pretty much it. They provide this kind of rational cover story for these deeper, often non-rational drives. And he connects this directly to the war happening around it.
How does he connect it to WWI?
He says you have these opposite but structurally similar sets of beliefs in England and Germany. Both sides passionately believe they are right, that they are defending civilization, that it's their absolute duty to prosecute the war.
Right. Both convinced of their own righteousness.
Exactly. But Russell implies the impulse to fight, to dominate or resist is primary. The deeply held beliefs are generated afterwards to serve that impulse.
Wow. Okay, that really turns the usual way of thinking about beliefs and actions on its head. So if beliefs are secondary, what are the primary impulses he sees driving this conflict, at least in these opening sections?
He focuses on two main ones here, the impulse of aggression and the impulse of resistance to aggression. And he notes, crucially, that these often operate even when they're quite contrary to reason.
Right, they aren't logical calculations. And these impulses, they create, what did he call it? A harvest of attendant beliefs.
Yes, exactly. A whole harvest. And the harvest that grows from the impulse of aggression is pretty stark.
What does it look like?
It produces this fierce conviction in your own group's superior excellence, this idea that you're somehow special, a chosen people.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads naturally to thinking that only the good or evil of your group really matters. Everyone else. You become just sort of material for the triumph or salvation of the higher race.
That sounds chillingly like the justifications used for, well, for a lot of terrible things throughout history. Does he give examples?
He points directly at imperialism as a prime example of this aggressive attitude in action.
Right.
He says flat out that Europe as a whole has this attitude towards Asia and Africa, and many Germans have this attitude towards the rest of Europe. It's this belief that your supposed superiority gives you the right to dominate. Might makes right, fueled by this sense of being inherently better.
And he brings in other examples too, doesn't he, to show this isn't just a modern German thing.
Oh yeah. He mentions figures like Bernhard, the German general, but also the early Mohammedan conquerors, even the book of Joshua in the Bible.
So he's tracing this impulse back through history.
He is. He's showing this isn't some aberration. It's a recurring pattern, driven by these fundamental human impulses manifesting in different historical contexts.
Okay, so we have these powerful, potentially destructive impulses like aggression and resistance, but surely human nature isn't only that. Does Russell balance this view?
He absolutely does. He contrasts these destructive impulses with what he calls the positive creative ones. He talks about love, about the instinct of constructiveness, the drive to build things, create art, science, and also just the simple joy of life itself.
Things that build connection and add value rather than destroy.
Exactly. But he sees these positive impulses as being, quote, very rare at present. Not because they aren't part of our nature, but because he believes they could become very common under better social institutions.
Ah, okay. So the potential is there, but the current environment, the way society is set up, works against them.
That's precisely his argument. He says these creative impulses are checked and enfeebled at present by the conditions under which men live.
And what are those conditions specifically? What's doing the checking and enfeebling?
He points directly at institutions, social structures, political systems, economic setups that are based on injustice and authority.
Injustice and authority.
Yeah. He argues that living within such systems forces people, almost requires them to, quote, close our hearts against sympathy and our minds against truth.
That's a really strong claim, that society itself forces us to suppress empathy and honesty just to function within it.
It's powerful, isn't it? And he connects this directly to the way we typically think about success.
How so?
He argues that chasing this sort of conventional, often materialistic definition of success makes people sacrifice these vital creative impulses. They end up losing the joy of life in listless weariness, feeling impotent in action. Their creative spark just dies down.
This sounds like it connects to his idea about individual growth. He talks about that, right?
Yes, very much so. He sees this fundamental principle of growth in every person, the potential to develop, learn, connect. But he argues this growth is actively hampered by institutions inherited from a simpler age.
So society's structures haven't kept pace with human potential.
That's the idea. Knowledge expands, the world changes, new possibilities open up. But if you still have these old, rigid institutions built on authority and tradition, they clash with the drive for liberty and justice.
Creating conflict.
A kind of universal strife, he calls it. This tension between the old ways based on authority and the newer possibilities based on freedom. And it leads to intimate disunion in how people relate to each other.
So paradoxically, the very act of fighting for freedom against these old structures can actually make it harder to achieve genuine connection.
That seems to be his point. He says that in this fight for freedom, people become less and less able to break down the walls of the ego, that sense of separate self, and achieve the kind of growth that comes from real and vital union with others.
The struggle itself reinforces the separation it's trying to overcome.
Right. The external fight sort of hardens the internal self, making real connection, real collaborative growth much more difficult, which leads him to look really closely at the role of authority and institutions.
He points out that historically, institutions are founded on authority, with a capital A.
He does. And he makes an interesting comparison with medieval society. He calls it organic.
Organic.
Because, he suggests, back then, the authority of the church, the king, whatever, was largely genuinely respected and acknowledged, even by those subject to it. It wasn't necessarily seen as an alien imposition.
So people kind of bought into it?
More or less. And in that specific context, he argues, outward submission could coexist with inward freedom, because the acceptance of authority felt, to some degree, voluntary. It felt like part of the natural order, not something constantly fighting against your will.
Okay, I see the contrast he's drawing, but that kind of widely accepted, almost voluntary authority, that's not really the basis for modern states or for something like nationalism, is it?
Not in the same way, no. And Russell is quite critical here. He argues that even something like nationalism, which often presents itself as people freeing themselves, actually leads by a natural movement to oppression and wars of conquest.
A natural movement. How does he see that happening? Why would freeing yourself lead to oppressing others?
He gives these really sharp historical examples. Think about France, he says. After it finally frees itself from English influence or control, what's one of the next things it does? It turns around and starts trying to conquer Italy.
Right.
Or Spain, after the centuries-long struggle to free itself from the Moors, it then gets into major conflicts with France.
Okay.
His point seems to be that when freedom is defined primarily as your group asserting its power or identity against another group, that very energy of assertion easily flips into dominating other groups. It becomes a kind of self-centered freedom that inevitably clashes with the freedom of others.
That's a really important distinction. So it's not just the existence of injustice that's the problem, but the awareness of it, the struggle against it, can also be damaging.
Yes, damaging to both sides. Those who uphold the injustice become hardened, and those who resist it can also become hardened in the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And the result, he says, is this hardening of the walls of the ego, making them a prison instead of a window.
A prison instead of a window. So your sense of self becomes closed off, defensive, rather than open to connection and understanding.
Exactly. Because, as he argues, real, unimpeded growth in the individual depends upon many contacts with other people. We need interaction to grow.
But not just any interaction.
Right. Crucially, these interactions need to be of the nature of free cooperation, not of enforced service. They have to be voluntary mutual exchanges, not relationships based on power or coercion.
And this brings us back to institutions, doesn't it? How should they be structured, then, to foster this kind of growth and avoid conflict?
Well, this is where he lands, at least in these opening pages. He concludes that our institutions, our social structures, must be based as far as possible upon voluntary combination, rather than the force of the law or the traditional authority of the holders of power.
Wow. That's pretty radical for 1916. He's suggesting that relying less on law and traditional power structures is the way forward. It's incredibly radical. He's essentially saying that the very things often seen as the bedrock of social order, coercive law, inherited authority, might actually be major obstacles to a healthy, peaceful society.
And without changing them.
He fears the world will just dissolve into these hard, separate units, each at war with all the others. He believes great and fundamental changes are needed in how we organize ourselves.
So the structure of our societies, often built on authority, isn't just failing to prevent conflict. It might actually be fueling it by aggravating that war within human nature.
That seems to be exactly his argument. The external structures exacerbate the internal potential for conflict, turning it into outright war.
Okay, so let's just recap this first deep dive into Russell's Why Men Fight. We've really focused on these opening arguments.
Yeah, we've seen him push past those surface explanations for war, blaming specific nations or diplomatic failures.
Right. And instead, he argues the deepest roots lie within, ordinary human nature, specifically in this conflict between destructive, possessive impulses and the more positive, creative ones. And then we explored how he sees our social institutions, particularly those built on historical authority and injustice, as actively getting in the way.
How they thwart individual growth, stifle those creative impulses.
And actually worsen this internal conflict, making external strife, like WWI, almost inevitable, and leading to that hardening of the walls of the ego he talks about.
It really casts the title of this episode, The War Within, in a
Yeah.
specific light, doesn't it? For Russell, the massive global conflict he was living through was, in a sense, a symptom.
A symptom of a more fundamental struggle.
Yeah.
That battle between competing impulses inside people, which then gets amplified and distorted by social structures that prevent real connection and growth.
It's a challenge then not just to look at leaders or policies, but to look inward and also at the very foundations of our communities.
Definitely. It forces a much deeper kind of questioning.
Which kind of leaves us, and you listening, with this final thought to chew on. If Russell has a point, even partially, that our strongly held beliefs are often just this homage which impulse pays to reason, rationalizations for deeper urges, how might understanding our own underlying impulses change how we look at disagreements today?
Right.
Whether it's big political conflicts or even just arguments in our own lives.
Yeah, it's a searching question. Is tackling that war within ourselves and maybe reforming the institutions that shape us truly the necessary first step if we ever hope to achieve lasting peace externally?